we're going to have some discussion from the panel here at the front, and I'll introduce our panel. We've got Nick Moon on the left here, from GfK NOP. Nick is no longer an ex-pollster, but still very much involved in polling and Secretary of the British Polling Council. Will Jennings, Professor of Politics at the University of Southampton and a member of the inquiry team. Yoni Kuhar from London School of Economics, Department of Statistics and Methodology Department, who is also a member of the inquiry panel. And on the end is Joel Williams, who is head of methods or something, executive head of methods or something like that, at TNS UK. And TNS, a sort of recent entrance into the polling world, and Joel was working on the EU referendum polls, and I think you have the claim, maybe disputed claim, to have got the closest to the referendum results. So there'll be some questions, and then I want to encourage questions, comments from the audience, have a bit of a discussion. We want to focus mainly on the methodology, but if people want to ask about the broader role of, should we, people often think we should ban opinion polls, they should be regulated. So we could get into that kind of territory if we have time. Okay, I'll kick off now. Here's what people always like, and this kind of goes, a great big table full of numbers. These are the final estimates in the week before the general election last year for pollsters that published vote intention estimates. And the key thing to look at here, I mean, there's a lot of numbers here, but this is the percentage for Conservatives, and this is the percentage for Labour, and these are the pollsters here. So you see Populous did an online poll, did the fieldwork 5th to the 6th of May, nearly 4,000 people, and they estimated the vote shares like this, so a dead heat. And down the bottom here we've got the actual result, 37.8 for Conservatives, 31.2 for Labour, and so on. And there's lots of things one can take from this table. One thing you might say is that they did pretty well on the smaller parties, but overall the real problem here was that they were pretty much uniformly saying it was going to be a dead heat. There's some variability in the levels, but they're all either 0, 1, or panel base have a difference of 2, but in the wrong direction. Okay, so they didn't do very well, and what this led us to expect is that it was going to be a hung parliament, and of course what we found out at 10 p.m. On election day. This is the result of the exit poll, which was actually conducted by a lot of people, but Yoni had a central role, as did Nick, in doing that work, which showed that the Conservatives actually they did slightly better than this, of course, but that moment I think seared on many people's brains when this was beamed up, and immediately obvious that there was a problem for the pollsters. I was asked to chair the inquiry into what had gone wrong. I established a team of people, and we set about our work, which we did over an academic period, should we say? It wasn't not quite Chilcot length, but it was more extended than some commentators thought would be optimal. But we did manage to report before the EU referendum polls, which I think was the key task. And we looked at a number of things, and we've published a report. You can look at that for the detail. I'm just going to cover some of the sort of main things that came out of our inquiry report. One of the things that we looked at was the sort of the historical accuracy of the polls, both in the UK and internationally. This is work really that Will Jennings has done. And there are a number of charts, but I'm just going to focus on this one. I think this is the sort of the key one, and this is the net error on the difference between the Conservative and the Labour parties at elections from 1945 to 2015. Okay, the net error doesn't adjust for the direction of the error, so you can overestimate the Labour lead, let's say, or you can underestimate the Labour, the Conservative lead. Sorry. Okay, so if you get it just right, you're on this horizontal line here, and if you're below, you're underestimating the Conservative lead, i.e. overestimating Labour. Above the line is the opposite. The dark circles are the average of the polls, the final polls. Okay, if we take this, I think it's a simple average, isn't it? Well, yeah, simple average. And then the clear circles are the individual poll estimates. Okay. So what we can see, there's a number of things again we can see from this. One thing is that the polls tend to be not exactly accurate, but there's some variability across polls. But that variability varies across elections. You know, so in some elections the polls are quite spread out here. 1975, well, there's 2 elections there, in fact. But 2015, they're all kind of bunched up, telling us all pretty much the same thing. Something else that we sort of highlighted in the report from this analysis is that the 2015 miss is here. The other really bad one was 1992. You can see these are, but there are other ones not too different in statistical error terms. We look at 97, 2001. They both overestimated Labour quite substantially, underestimated the lead by nearly the same amount, but that was overestimating the size of a landslide. Okay, they got the right winner. Okay, and that is the key thing really in terms of how the public and politicians judge polling misses, not so much in terms of statistical measures of error. One other thing to notice about this is that you can see there's if you put a line through this, there'd be a sort of downward trend. So there's been a tendency to overestimate the size of the Labour share and underestimate the size of the Conservative share, with some deviations from that. But that's been a general pattern, and that's despite the fact that the pollsters have been taking measures. They know that's happening, so they've been doing things. So there is this kind of systematic tendency to overestimate Labour and to underestimate the Conservatives. Another thing that's a nice chart here is that the sort of explosion in the number of polls that are done, largely. So this is on the y-axis here. We've got the number of polls per number of polls by quarter in units of up to 150 here in a quarter. So you can see that over time there's been a massive increase, largely explained by the fact there are more online polls these days. Online polls are much cheaper to do. So what we did was to look at a whole list of possible causes, things that other people had suggested might have at least partially contributed to the error, and we looked at all of these and we kind of concluded that they didn't really contribute anything to what had gone wrong. So it was like the murder on the Orient Express, and we were eliminating these potential culprits from the inquiry. So it wasn't to do with postal voting. Postal voters were dealt with in the way that they should be pretty much by the pollsters. There was some concern because we were switching the voter registration system from household to individual, that this was going to mean that some people thought they were registered. They'd tell the pollster, I'm going to vote Labour, and then they turn up at the polling booth and find they weren't registered. But that didn't seem to have happened. Overseas voters, just not enough of them to make a difference. There was some speculation about placement of the questions in the questionnaire and whether you're asking about your local constituency or the national picture. Again, there was some experiments run on the British election study which enabled us to discount that as it's not that question wording doesn't matter, it can make a difference, but it wasn't systematic enough to cause this gap. Of course, one of the really difficult things that the pollsters have to do is not just ask people who they're going to vote for, but are you going to vote? Because, of course, in the general election, only 65% of people who are eligible turned out to vote. So they've somehow got to take that into account, and that's a tricky thing to do. There are different ways of doing it. And it's fair to say that the ways that the pollsters in the UK have done it traditionally have been, low tech, shall we say. That's not to say that high tech is necessarily better, a very sophisticated modelling approach. But when we looked at that, it didn't seem to have made much of a difference. Using different turnout weighting approaches didn't really shift the estimates very much. So we concluded that although turnout weighting is a potentially weak part of the methodology, it didn't contribute to the miss this time. Mode of interview was an interesting one. Again, it was leading up to the referendum, and we'll come back to that. There was a difference between online and phone polls leading up to the election. So the phone polls were getting more Conservative voters, more or less, throughout the campaign. But in the final polls, there was no difference. That completely disappeared. So there was no difference in those estimates. But if you look further out, there was a tendency for the phone to get more Conservative voters. And I think that's one of the reasons why there was a belief that phone poll estimates were more accurate leading up to the referendum, because they'd sort of been more accurate in getting more Conservative voters previously. That turned out not to be the case, of course, and it's a rather simplistic inference, I guess. But in the general election, mode of interview, tricky one to assess, but certainly in the final polls, no difference. Late swing is something that can happen. People between the final week and days of the campaign, people change their minds. So the polls could have given us the broadly or correcter or less incorrect estimates, and then people have just changed their mind. But a number of the pollsters had gone back and done recontact surveys. So we were able to look at estimates of the vote shares, not based on what people who said they were going to vote, but who they had actually, or who they reported that they'd actually voted for. And we didn't find any real evidence. There was maybe some weak evidence that there'd been a bit of a shift to the Conservatives, but that was a pretty noisy estimate. And there's an issue of kind of people deliberately telling us that, telling pollsters that they are going to vote Labour and then actually voting Conservative. That's a tricky one. Okay, if people consistently lie to pollsters, it's pretty difficult to tease that out empirically. We were able to discount the possibility that people lied beforehand and then were sort of honest afterwards. And we also ruled this deliberate misreporting out as a major contributory factor. Probably people do it, but we didn't think it was a major contributory factor because it was inconsistent with some of the other evidence that we looked at as part of the inquiry. So this led us through a sort of process of deduction to conclude that it was basically the sampling, the way that the pollsters had put their samples together had just left them with too many Labour voters and too few Conservative voters. I remember being actually, I was interviewed on the Today programme and feeling rather awkward when, so it's taken you 10 months, Professor, to figure out that the samples had too many Labour voters and not enough Conservatives. Well, it is a bit more complicated than that. Through elimination of other possibilities, but it wasn't just that. We were able to make some comparisons, not perfect comparisons, but we had these two surveys, the British Election Study, British Social Attitude Survey, that were done after the election. These are random sample surveys, so use a different sampling approach. If we look at the green line here is the truth, and these are the estimates of the difference between Labour and Conservative for these two studies, and we can compare that to the estimates for the final polls. And if we look at this same chart using the follow-up survey, i.e. who did you vote for, not who are you going to vote for, so that's a like-for-like comparison. Because some people said, rightly enough, this isn't a fair comparison because these were sort of typical academic surveys. They're predicting things after the event. We go back and ask people, who did you vote for? But we can make a more like-for-like comparison. We still find the same thing. So that's one thing that we were able to do. I won't go into sort of all the detail of the methodology of quota sampling, but the key assumption of the polls is that they use quotas so that the samples that they have match the population according to some known characteristics. Okay, now if we keep things simple, we know what the age distribution is in the population approximately from the census. Okay, so the pollsters can fill up their samples and weight their samples so that they match that distribution, and they can do that with more than one variable. Now, if the assumption that they need to hold for that to yield unbiased estimates is that the vote intention of people in their sample within those quota cells is the same as it is in the population. Okay, now that's quite a big assumption. It's another one of the reasons why we weren't, perhaps surprised when sampling came out as one of the causes. But here's just a check of that assumption. Okay, so this is the difference, the estimate of the difference between Conservative and Labour within different regions of the country. And you can see that in some regions the assumption holds, the green and the brown lines are the British election study and the British social attitude survey. These are the polls. The green line is, no, that's wrong. Help me out. The brown line is the poll, and the green line is the BES.
No, the green line, because this is regions are the real result.
This is the real result, of course, yes. The real result is this, and the brown line is the poll. So the difference is underestimated in these regions, ones that the Conservatives tend to do better in. Anyway, we were able to show clearly the sort of violation of a key assumption of the methodology. Another thing that we were able to look at was one of the difficulties we had was that actually a lot of the ways that we could identify bias are kind of fixed by design, because the poll samples are quota samples, and they're already matching the population on these distributions. But if we look at this top age band, so the pollsters use banded ages. So the highest level it's going to be 65 and above. Okay. Now, if we look at the continuous age distribution within that highest age band, you can see that again the green line is the British elections. No, the green line is the census. The gold line is the British election study, and these are the polls that ask continuous age. So you can see that in this top age group, the polls are almost all in the 65 to 75 age group, so they're underestimating the oldest old. Okay, so if there's a difference in the vote intention of these groups, then that will be a bias. Okay, I better keep moving on. So that's what we concluded anyway. That we go into more detail in the report. Something else that we looked at was this issue of herding. Because as you saw in that first table, it's kind of, if these are random samples, we'd expect a bit more variability in the estimate of the lead, but they're already bunched together. It's kind of a hard thing to get at, and it's a controversial issue because one way of interpreting it is that pollster A gets on the phone to pollster B and says, my estimates are a bit, what are yours like? And they kind of collude. And there's been these kind of accusations that they're doing this deliberately. Now, our take on this was rather different to that. We think that insofar as this kind of effect happens, it comes about through people doing their best to get the best estimate. And by doing their best, what they're going to do is fiddle around with adjustments, because you don't just collect the data and publish the raw estimates. You have to make adjustments to do with weighting, to do with likelihood to vote. People who won't tell you who they're going to vote for, they say they don't know. There are lots of decisions that have to be made, and different decisions will take you in different directions. Now, what you are likely going to be informed by if you try something out is your expectation of what the true picture is. Okay, you pull one lever, it shifts you in a direction. You think, is that plausible? Now, your decision about whether it's plausible is going to be based on what the other polls recently have said. So there's an entirely, if you like, innocent way that this could happen. And if we look at this is the change in the variance of the lead, and we can compare, that's the dark line here, and you can see it tails off. And we can compare that, if you like, to a sort of standard assumption that the variance is changing proportional to a sample that would be a simple random sample or a stratified sample. So this is a more generous assumption. Under both of those assumptions, the lead kind of tails off, the variance in the lead tails off. So we concluded that there was some herding going on in the estimates. So our conclusions were that, well, we didn't want to bash the polls. I mean, we're still of the view that they're the best way of doing this, and I think despite the fact that the newspapers and so on were coming out saying polls are terrible, we're not going to, that hasn't exactly been borne out in the lead up to the EU referendum polls. So they're going to be around, and so we've got to try and do our best to make them as accurate as possible and to understand their error properties. They are prone to a range of errors, and when we think that they can tell us what the result is going to be to a margin of 1%, we're endowing them with more accuracy than they're capable of delivering. There are weaknesses at various points in the methodology, so it's not surprising that they go wrong in systematic ways. There's not a lot of scope for doing things radically different. One of the things that we suggested in our recommendations, I'll come to in a minute, is that there be a random sample, and actually a couple of pollsters did implement this, and it didn't go well in the sense that they were less accurate than the quota samples. So there's some interesting stuff coming out of this already, I think. But so random is one way to go. Maybe probably not a useful way for getting closer to the truth. And there's not a lot of scope for doing things terribly different, although the pollsters have been experimenting with things. So we made 12 recommendations. Some of them are kind of tinkering at the margins, like these. I don't know why these have all come out as underlined, but these are kind of you could do things a bit better within the way you do things now. Those first ones. We've made some recommendations about being more transparent in the way that polls are reported, and also how they actually, which quotas they use, how they recruit respondents, and so on. So we've made these kind of general suggestions about getting a broader pool of people into their samples, about potentially using different weighting variables, but there's only so far that one can go with these. They're not certainly going to be a panacea, but there is certainly evidence, I think, that some pollsters were experimenting with those. Here's this recommendation that I mentioned, that the ESRC should fund a random survey for 2020. We made some recommendations, I say, about transparency, about saying, if you change your methods, you should be very clear about this. You should report any changes. I think that's been sort of reasonably successful. We haven't quite looked at exactly how clearly they've communicated that, and making the data available if it's requested, and so on. Something that hasn't been well received by the pollsters is the idea that they should pre-register their intention to. It's a bit like doing an RCT, and this would deal with some of the potentially the herding issue. We can maybe come back to this, but I suspect this isn't going to happen, and unless they have another major screw up in 2020 and there's lots of herding, then we may come back to this. And something else that we recommended, which hasn't been implemented yet, but the BPC, British Polling Council, made clear that this was something that's being looked at for essentially the referendum came round too quickly to do this, but I think this is something that's going to happen, which is to provide better measures of margins of error that more realistically reflect the sample designs, and provide some statistical test of whether things have changed, because you often get this reporting. We all know there's been a 1-point surge in support for Remain or something. Well, that's not really a significant difference, and maybe we would get sort of different reporting and different designs of polls perhaps if that was not the case. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour through the general election poll miss. I'll now hand over to Will Jennings, who's going to give a quick summary of the EU referendum.
The EU referendum in this as well, right? So, yeah, so I mean, unlike the work that we did on the polling inquiry, this is all based on a much more cursory overview of the evidence so far. And actually, one of the things that we don't actually have a lot of the individual level data, so the polling inquiry was able to look at find the actual details and the machinations of the actual individual level data, and this is all based on aggregate level analysis of the polls. And what I'm just going to do is kind of give you some answers to some of these questions. How did the final polls perform comparatively? How did the polls line up with the final result over time, actually? So to try and not only get a sense of what the errors in the final polls were, but what sort of story were the polls telling about the EU referendum during the long campaign. I think that's actually one of the really kind of relevant debates for social sciences around the role of surveys and polling, which I'm not sympathetic to ideas about banning opinion polls or kind of hyper-regulation. They do actually tell us a story about the nature of election horse races, about the referendum campaign. They influence decision makers, and hopefully this will kind of give us a little sense of whether or not the polls actually influence that. Then I'll also have a quick look at actually how, when the pollsters adjusted their methods, and looking specifically at the final polls. When I started out drawing up this presentation, I had this ambition of kind of documenting every single methodological change since autumn of last year that the pollsters made, and there's actually, it's one of these things, when you look at the headline poll numbers, kind of remains on 53, you often don't realise how much of it has been cranked and changed in methodologies over time. It's not just a single kind of one or two methodological changes over a 9-month period. There'll be a lot. Several pollsters will change their methodologies a couple of times, even in the short final kind of 5-6 weeks. So actually it's quite difficult to document that. So I'll focus on the final polls. And I'll also then ask the question based on actually what the pollsters report on themselves, how did those methodological changes in the final polls impact on their accuracy? And this speaks a little bit to the issue of herding. And I put up on Twitter yesterday one already of the slides I'm going to show you, and one or two of the pollsters got slightly upset already actually about kind of some of the implications that might be drawn. So these are, as a table, it's good actually just perhaps giving you an overview of all the sorts of ways I'm going to present the data to you. This is the final set of polls for the referendum campaign. Actually all the pollsters here are BPC members. I haven't listed TNS and Joel as BPC members simply because you weren't in the final list of the British Council polls, which we can see for political reasons. But again, we have this very similar story on the polling this. So we have the final Remain figure, as we know, was around 48%, and Leave was 52%. But the final polls were putting the average of around 52% for Remain and 48% for Leave, right? So they were telling us the wrong story about the likely result. And you can see the mean absolute error on the final polls on the very right-hand column, and you can see the pollsters that did well, TNS, Opinion, you got this kind of slightly better than others, and pollsters that did very badly, Populous had the largest error, Comrades, who were very bullish about telephone polls, also had a substantial error. And again, some of this, this is a kind of search methods festival, right? We're kind of interested in methodology. This matters actually in terms of politics because you may not know that Populous are the pollsters run by Andrew Cooper, amongst others, who was very close to David Cameron and integral to the Remain campaign, right? So if you think that polls don't matter for politics, I can assure you they do. And I can only speculate at this point, if the Populist numbers were similar to the Remain numbers, right, that may have very substantially influenced the Remain campaign and the sorts of messages that were given out, right? So this is where we start. Actually, I think one of the interesting aspects of the referendum was that although we know the polls didn't tell us the right story, there hasn't been the same sort of reaction after the result there was after the morning of the general election. So I think by about 7 o'clock in the morning of May 2015, after the general election, John Curtis had said, there needs to be an inquiry. And on one personal level, I was quite relieved there wasn't going to be another inquiry, because after about 9 months' work, it seemed like an awful lot of work to do the same thing again. But actually, we had a similar sort of miss. So this is, as Patrick showed you, this is comparing the polling errors on the final polls across all the major elections in the UK in the last year and a half or so. So you can see on the far left-hand side the polls for the referendum campaign, and the black dot is the average, and the error was worse than in the general election. right? And the only difference, actually, and it was a very different story, was the numbers were much more spread, right? So there were pollsters like TNS and Opinion who got much closer, and there were pollsters who were way really bad errors, right? But actually, there's a lot of talk about kind of polling and crisis in the UK, and maybe if we can get into this when we start thinking about kind of sampling and polls at the individual level. But not all polls are doing badly. So, for example, you can see in the mayoral election the errors are much lower in the first round and even lower in the second round. In the Scottish polls for the general elections, the errors were lower than in the Westminster polls, and they were lower still in the Scottish Parliament elections and the Welsh Assembly elections. Those were both done by the Wales poll was done by YouGov. So actually we're seeing kind of varied pattern, and again, I can't really speak to it, but there has been talk about whether or not there's something about rural-urban polls or so forth that has kind of made London easier to poll or not. Or it may also just be that in preferential voting systems it's actually also easier to measure preferences. I think the Australian election polls actually got it closer to the did a pretty good job last week, actually. I think you could argue that that's partly when you've got a two-party preferred voting system. So that's the kind of story that we've got, which is the EU referendum polls did a pretty bad job. This is kind of based on an approach that I've used in work with Crystal Legion, is looking at the mean absolute error over time, actually, because although it's interesting to look at the error in the final polls and the final results, it actually tells you something about, first of all, how the polls line up with the final results. When we do this a lot of comparative work cross-nationally, you see actually the errors kind of narrow down towards the election results as electoral preferences form. And actually, when I produced this, the interesting thing about EU referendum result is that earlier on there are higher errors. They're not kind of real errors in the sense they suggested that the support for Remain was higher early during the campaign. But they do come into focus, so that's just a kind of polynomial line of best fit. And you see the errors are higher out further back in time, and as we get towards June 2016 and June 23rd, the errors decline, right? So on one level, you could actually say the polls did provide us some information about the state of the race, right? They're not completely useless. They tell us that whatever advantage Remain had, it was declining, and the Leave campaign should have been getting stronger. However, if you look at the net error on Remain, with 0 as the final, with the red line indicating 0, you can see where the problem of what the polls were telling us was, which was that polls systematically tended to overstate their support for Remain, right? Of course, this doesn't allow for the fact that maybe preferences moved wildly during the campaign, but from what we know, it doesn't really seem very likely. And so the polls were systematically telling us that Remain support was higher than it was, and there were very few polls that were actually putting kind of Leave in the lead. And actually, it's rather interesting. I think if you're a pollster, you'd really rather have stopped the clock about a week out, right? And it speaks to, because actually they were starting to show, quite a number of polls showed about a week and a half out a lead for Leave. And actually, it speaks a little bit to Hurley that the ICM did a dual mode poll experiment, I think a couple of weeks out, maybe 3 weeks out from the referendum, which both showed Leave in the lead. And I think Martin Boog was so worried about this, they didn't release any more pool polls afterwards, right? And that is actually one of the definitions of Hurley in some sense. I mean, they didn't suppress polls, but they stopped because they were so kind of worried about the methodology, right? So this is really where the problem was. Now, one of the issues that's come up out of this was this issue of online phone that Patrick mentioned. And here again, you can actually see, in terms of mean absolute error, the mean absolute errors for the telephone polls were far higher. Okay, so actually, again, you may not have read all the debates, but there was at various points during the campaign quite a lot of, I'm not sure I'd call it ill feeling between online and telephone pollsters, but there was fairly and quite a vigorous debate over the methods, the benefits of the various methods. And what we see now is actually that the pro-Remain bias was higher in the telephone polls. And that also again comes through if you look at the lead. And actually, if for example we'd taken out telephone polls altogether and just looked at the error on the online polls, they might actually have told us a slightly different story, or a kind of much more stable story about preferences. And again, it's difficult. The only test we have of the polls is on election day, But given what we know about kind of public attitudes and kind of voting behaviour, there might be some expectation that preferences will be relatively stable. And maybe if you looked at the online polls, it wouldn't have just been such a surprise when Leave won. Now, let me just kind of talk briefly about because I don't want to go on too long, about the final poll, the methodological adjustments in the final polls. As I said, it was actually quite difficult to look back any further because it was going to get very complicated. So these are the methodological changes in just the final poll, apart from Opinion, who changed this at the start of June. Okay, so I just wanted to include it because that was the major methodological change. And when I did this, I mean, it's not uncommon for pollsters in their final poll to make a little tweak. For example, Mori often have made their final poll only people who are certain to vote. I think now they do it as a matter of course. But actually it's not uncommon. But it's surprising when you look at it that 5 out of 9 pollsters changed their method in the final poll, right? This speaks this you have heard it not because it's about kind of everyone moving to a common single point, but it's about pollsters adjusting their methodologies and their choices based on expectations about the result. So for example, you can see Orb in their final poll changed so that it was only people who indicated they're definite to vote, and they made an assumption about don't know is breaking 3 want to remain, right? So that was a kind of an assumption based on expectations around loss aversion, people being kind of not liking risk. Comrades in their final poll reallocated don't know on there's a question about the economy as to whether people thought Brexit would be bad for the economy, and then they changed their target population to include Northern Ireland, not Great Britain, right? And it's kind of interesting on one level because many pollsters do just often poll Great Britain, but then they felt they had to include Northern Ireland, so added that to the mix. I mean, it's quite interesting that pollsters would do this in the final poll, right? I mean, it's one of those things that I'm not sure if you were, you're kind of a good analogy, right? If you got the most important test of your methodology, you probably the first time you test it wouldn't be on the kind of the Grand National, right? You might give the horse a run out before the Grand National, before you check it can actually run, right? Opinion actually did something different, changing their weighting targets based on attitudinal questions relating to British election study data. So actually kind of drawing a little bit on things the polling inquiry did, but that was a little bit further back in time. YouGov just changed their target population, also changed the weighting by reported probability of voting. Ipsos Mori changed so only those included for whom the outcome was important or very important were included. And TNS, unlike actually others, didn't weight by likelihood to vote. If that's right, Joel, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Okay, you can clarify. But what's actually very useful and interesting was the pollsters then, in most of the discussion of these, clarified what the impact on voting, the reported voting intentions was of these methodological changes, and that's in the far right-hand column. And the most striking thing is that all of them, apart from TNS, all the methodological changes favoured Remain, right? They boosted the Remain numbers up by a range of 1 to 3%, and of course, the deals did as well. Okay, so my number is even more accentuated, right? So we see this kind of move. So actually you can see here, so here's an example of what Opinion did when they changed their method a little bit. And it's actually why it's quite difficult to get a handle on the campaign. Was in this poll just at the start of June, they introduced this new weighting method, which boosted Remain and then increased the error on Remain. So if you're Opinion at this point, you're thinking, actually, maybe this methodological change didn't help me very much, although they did get actually quite close to the results. They performed not too badly, so it didn't affect them as badly. But if you just look here on terms of the mean absolute error, on the left-hand side you've got and now Joel's told me this, I know worrying my numbers are slightly wrong, but the EU referendum polls as reported and the unadjusted figures if they hadn't made those last-minute methodological changes. And what you can actually see is that the error is actually lower with the unadjusted figures. So these last-minute methodological tweaks actually increase the error. Okay, and it's the same as well if you look at the net error on Remain instead of the mean absolute error. There's more spread in the unadjusted figures, but actually increase the error. So that's kind of really where I wanted to leave it really, which is actually that essentially, you have this bad polling miss. I think it is interesting that we have the 2015 election story about the telephone polls, I think, giving a more accurate story. Now, online seems to be the methodology of choice. And I suppose I would have a word of caution there, which is that I had this sort of anxiety, I had this feeling a little while ago, and I'm not sure actually I put it in writing, which was that the polls in the EU referendum could get it right for the wrong reasons, right? That online polls might find people who are slightly politically more enthusiastic, which might be a better proxy for the sorts of people who are going to vote in the referendum campaign. I have no basis for knowing that that's true, but it might just be that when we go to the next general election, we can't be kind of absolutely certain that telephone polls will tell a more accurate story. What's interesting here is that the errors are much more spread than the general election. Now that might be to do with pollster behaviour. It might also just be due to the fact that I think a lot of people are saying, well ahead of the referendum, that it's much more difficult to poll and run surveys on the referendum because we have so fewer priors about how people are going to behave. So for general elections, we have a very good sense of what drives people's voting behaviour. We know the sorts of people who support different parties. We know that if we ask your past voting intention, that's a fairly good, for your past vote, that's a fairly good predictor of your future vote. In the referendum, we didn't have that. But I think the most striking thing for me, just putting this together this talk, was that those adjustments increased the error. And so I think, Patrick talked about this idea of kind of pre-registering polls, but I think this notion that pollsters in the final poll affect their methods based on some assumptions around what they think is going on is highly problematic and probably not beneficial to them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Great. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that there was a newsletter of the Social Research Association published in the week of the referendum in which we were asked to give out personal forecasts of what the results would be. And I said 54% will remain. I didn't say that my confidence interval was 6% on either side. Okay, so what I'll do is initially just ask the panel if you have any sort of first responses to what's been said, anything that you would like to remark on about the two sort of day markers, are they both day markers, anything like that? Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a sort of more significant point that I will save to a little bit later, but a couple of minor ones. It struck me actually when you were putting up the thing about age that you probably, about the very old, you probably don't factor into that the extent to which I suspect voting actual turnout is much lower amongst those people. Peter Kellner always had this argument that there was the turnout among the group of people who could be reached by opinion polls was actually much higher than turnout in the country as a whole, because there were plenty of people who were dead to start off with, but there were people who were actually in long-stay institutions who in practice were very unlikely to vote, but it were also not likely to be caught by opinion polls, and so you would expect some degree of difference there. I was very much struck by Will's Grand National analogy, but he's actually hit the nail perfectly on the head, possibly unwittingly, about just how hard it is to develop methodology for polling, because he says, well, surely you try it out, if you're running a new horse, you try it somewhere else. Well, suppose I've got a horse that I really quite fancy for the Grand National, I want to try it out somewhere else. I found that the only options to me, first of all, they're all flat races, because there's no jumps anywhere, and they're all short little races, they're only a few furlongs, and there's no other decent horses in it. Because that's basically the chances I've got when I'm developing new polls. I can try it in local elections, I can try it in all sorts of things that no one really cares about, and people like to behave completely differently. So that is the trouble of polling, is that you've only got the chance to have a real test of what you're doing once every 5 years. And there's a perfectly reasonable chance that actually you found a cracking way of solving it, and it's now 5 years out of date, the population's moved on, and it doesn't actually work the next time, which is what makes polling so incredibly difficult.
Thanks. Yeah, is there anything to say? No? John, as a pollster?
As an actual pollster, I was just thinking about the very last week, and you said, well, we switched from turnout weighted to just essentially registered voter thing. There were a couple of reasons for that, because we had done the turnout weighting before, but then we started to think that we were assuming too much, because the turnout, the model we were using was specific to our panel, but also specific to the 2015 general election. And it, for instance, is very strongly based on what people's stated likelihood to vote was, but we also added a penalty if they hadn't voted in the previous general election, and also some penalties if they were younger, which reflected how the panel had reported in a recontact survey. But then we thought, we're making a lot of assumptions here, and we weren't so confident of them, which is why we ended up we actually issued both of them, but actually decided that the headline would be just registered voters. And we also, when we did that, we didn't actually rebase out the don't knows, because effectively when you do that, you're saying, well, here's my likelihood to vote model. Everyone who says don't know doesn't vote, and everyone who gives an opinion does vote. And by lucky chance, that meant that we were extremely accurate on the final thing. But I don't think I think it would be actually better to look at the kind of likelihood to vote model with an imputation for don't know. But I was concerned about imputing the don't knows, because you were imputed on the basis of all sorts of other things they've told you about what they think about Europe and who they voted for previously and so on. Yet somehow they haven't told you where they're going to go on the referendum. Now, if we'd have imputed just on the basis of other information, we'd have said these undecideds are going to break 45% Remain, 55% Leave. Now, we've just done the Recontact survey from this, and actually it suggests a 2-to-1 for Remain amongst the undecided. So had we imputed, assuming a missing at random assumption, we would have made things considerably worse. And if I back engineer this and say, okay, well, let's do the 2-to-1 assumption, then in fact the voter model that we were concerned about wasn't too bad at all, and in fact was very strongly correlated with a model that was based on this stuff. So we were overcautious, but accidentally that made us a little bit closer to the actual result once, it was inevitably rebased by everybody who used the data. But that was the reason for switching, but we still nevertheless presented the results.
Any thoughts on the online, the poll, the phone lesson? Will was warning that this may not be something which carries over to the next campaign in 2020. Nick, do you think it's a sort of decisive victory for online or something?
No, I see YouGov are claiming that it's now proved once and for all online is the only way to do polling, but I don't think that's necessarily true. And you can look at the online BES, which was far less accurate than the face-to-face random sample BES. Yeah, there's no doubt they did do better in this election, but again, does that mean they're going to do better in the next one? I don't know. I think it's unlikely. It's perfectly likely, but I think there's no guarantee that they will. I think you can't just say that's it. That's laid the issue to bed, as they claim.
Anything further to add on that?
No, I mean, I think it's just it's the caution that's required about completely ruling out one method over the other. I think that's important. And Joel, I personally am in favour of more parsimonious design, so an adjustment. So I think simplifying your final poll, I probably have much less problem than cranking and making assumptions about the ways don't knows break and so forth. And that tends to be what happens, is that people then add more nuts and bolts to their model in the final. And I think from I fully appreciate how difficult polling is. That it's always striking to me, and I know the reason is that people's minds are really focused on the final poll. But it's always striking to me is that there are big cognitive risks around setting your model at the final day of the election, the campaign. And if you went for the short campaign of six weeks out, and I think if pollsters as a rule set their final methodology at that point, they'd probably be less susceptible to not necessarily herding, but kind of responses to the broader environment, some of which might be informative, but actually, we talked about that, the final predictions that we made. And I found myself during the final week or so getting caught up by things like the NatCen probability poll, other information where you hear things about the campaign. And I think even if they are subconscious influence on methodological choices, it's very telling that all the methodological choices did end up favouring Remain, whereas actually you'd think if these were based on people questioning the assumptions of their models, there would by random be someone who says, actually, no, my models, maybe it's a little bit too pro-Remain, we need to reduce it the other way. And given that was the narrative that has been going on, I think personally, I think it would be better for kind of polling to, I agree with Nick that you can only test it on the day, but actually setting up the final model for the final 3 weeks to have that stability. Partly because people actually are very uninformed users of polls. So the media don't understand when methodological changes are made. Even so many political scientists don't understand methodological changes. So there was a blog on the LSE blog yesterday by people who will remain nameless talking about house effects, which didn't reflect the fact that the methodologies are changing all the time. So you can't say there's an opinion house effect because their methodological adjustments during the campaign mean their pro-Remain or pro-Leave bias changes over time.
Well, as somebody who did make some voting changes through that campaign, you cannot get it out of your head. I couldn't get the Nat Sen thing out of my head, but of course you'd passed a little bit of information as well. So that was in my head. But what I was doing, I started to... What I was actually saying was that I was, in my head, I was thinking, this is inaccurate. Well, how is it inaccurate? So I started to go back to the British election study and look at the sort of interaction, pass vote by education, age, region, and things like that, and also you're looking at the real data, and started to apply a much more intense net of weights across the whole thing. But my concern was, okay, these are clearly different. So, for instance, we seem to be systematically getting too few Conservatives in the South East and too many in London, and I wanted to do something about that. But I wasn't. But in my head, of course, was this thing that the thing is, I applied all this, and it never actually shifted towards Remain, which in my head I wanted to do. But in the end, I thought, well, this is as good as I can do. And then right towards the end, we realised that this was actually just too much weighting. It wasn't actually changing anything. There was too much of it. So we stripped several of those totals out towards the end, just in order to have just less variance in the weights. So it is fiddling around, and it was fiddling around due to a lack of confidence in what we'd actually produced.
You're being very sort of open and honest about the psychology of doing this, and it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't fit very much with what our thinking was about how herding operates. And I think one of the things that we see in the chart that Will put up is that these changes did sort of move everyone in the direction of Remain. And almost certainly those weren't the only things that were tried out, right? So there were other things. So we don't see, of the kind of the universe of possible changes, what those. You could be pretty certain that if you'd have tried something and it had pulled it towards Leave, then that would have not been implemented.
The one thing, we only tried one thing that actually did pull things towards Remain.
Can you speak up a bit?
We only tried one thing that I think actually pushed things towards Remain, which was, and it wasn't dissimilar to what Opinion did, which was about, it was a question which is on an official statistics survey about, do the people in this area get on, the different sorts of people in this area get on well together, which is a kind of sort of proxy for, do you like there being an ethnically diverse area around you? And we put that in. We noticed it was off. But the difference between what we did and what Opinion did, Opinion decided to weight it to the British social attitudes, I think. But face-to-face data is completely different from web data. And we had done a prior experiment which included this question. So we actually did a web-adjusted weighting target for that. And I think they made a serious error by not doing that and assuming that people respond the same way in face-to-face interviews as online, because exactly the same people that answer those questions and responded quite differently online.
Well, so I come back to the whole thing about reallocating the don't knows. I think it is quite an interesting thing. There was quite an argument that's sort of going on about there's this general historical tendency that referendums have tended to favour the status quo. Almost every referendum, you can sort of think of, not just in this country, but around the world, has generally tended to, favour the status quo. Even sort of recently, the New Zealand flag being the most recent example. And there's a very interesting academic called Claire Durand at the University of Montreal, I think it is, who writes an excellent blog called Les Sondages. And she'd written about Scotland, and she'd addressed all the Scottish polls and has said, because of this thing, I'm going to reallocate all the don't knows 2-1 in favour of no, because that's what I think will happen, and produced a more accurate result than any of the polls had done by doing so. And she then applied exactly the same thing to the referendum, the EU one, and of course made things, then that made it even worse. But she then sort of came back with this rather interesting theory that she should have weighted it the other way, because on the grounds that, that for older people, the status quo was actually before we were in Europe at all, because older people were important. And that sounded like quite a clever bit of post-hoc rationalisation. So I started thinking, well, hold on a minute. If you actually wanted to experience any real lengthy period of life pre-being in the EEC, you'd need to be about 80. There aren't that many of those. So, but it's an example of how it seems at the time to be perfectly reasonable. Not just have all the other referendums tending to vote for status quo, but the movement in the polls in the last few days in all those referendums has always been towards the status quo. And one way in which you can hypothesise that is caused is because the don't knows are split in that way. So it seemed a perfectly sensible thing to do. In this particular case, it turned out to make it worse.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that was playing into that strong belief was the betting markets, which were very much part of this debate. And I remember speaking to people the night, around sort of 9 p.m. I think Nigel Farage had conceded, and there was some Twitter rumour that Boris Johnson had conceded as well. And the betting markets have made it sort of the leave win is virtually impossible now. And I don't think this can't be true. We cannot know what all we've got really is the polls, the sort of exuberance of the people in the city and betting markets doesn't really amount to much. But that's something else I wanted to put on. What I'll do is I'll ask another question and say, think of everything you've ever wanted to ask a pollster, but we're afraid to ask questions, and I'll get them from you in a minute. But something else that was unusual about this campaign was the number of kind of privately commissioned polls that were being done by banks and hedge funds and so on, that were, I guess, sort of known about, because it's pretty impossible to do a great big survey, particularly a face-to-face one. And an exit poll will come on to that in a moment. But so that was an interesting. If you've got any comments on that aspect of it, but also the random survey part of it, because some of those surveys that were done privately and weren't published were random surveys, but seem to have all got the result quite wrong. And we can frame to make it easier as things are. We can talk about the NATSM one. If anyone has any observations about how we interpret this, one interpretation is that they weren't far off being right if you look at the confidence intervals, as you should do for a random survey, but maybe you've got a different take on that.
Yeah, that's special pleading of a really extreme kind, I have to say, by a man who's just seen his panacea blown completely out of the water. I speak as someone who believes very strongly in random sampling and believe that it is, the ideal way of doing things, provided you don't mind, waiting long enough for it to happen. But it is particularly apposite that after the inquiry did conclude that building some kind of random thing into random sampling into polling, and somehow whether this will be a SLC sponsored thing or whatever, would make things a lot better. And now we've got some fairly comprehensive evidence that that's not the answer at all. It may be better in a lot of ways, but clearly in that case it's worse in other ways to make it up for it. Because a lot was made in the run-up to the referendum, and the whole discussion about online versus telephone was what the figures were from the two sort of big random samples done at the back end of last year, the British Election Study and BSA. Both of which show pretty much 2-to-1 majorities for Remain. Now, you can try and argue that, of course that was right at the time, that the whole population moved massively from being massively in favour of Remain to being smallly in favour of Leave in the space of 6 to 9 months, and I'll say I don't believe you. It's just not plausible. Then we got as Pat mentioned, the NatSem one, where they've made their own internet panel. A very smart, very interesting and clever move. They've taken people from BSA, asked them if they'll be in a panel. If they say yes, if they're on the internet, do them on the internet. If they're not on the internet, do them by phone. Interesting idea. But two things about it. Firstly, it's still, even with that, it took them 6 weeks, I think it was, to get their sample, even with people who'd signed up already, and most of whom were doing it online. 6 weeks, really, I don't think that's very, very helpful to journalists and so on. And secondly, they were massively wrong. They were one of the worst polls of all. We did a random sample survey during the election. I can't tell you who it's for, sadly. And I know of another polling agency that did a random sample on exactly the same circumstances. What I can tell you was that we managed to do it in about 2 weeks, both of us, samples in a 2-week fieldwork period. We got reasonably tolerable response rates, and we both got it completely wrong. We were as wrong as the worst of the pollsters. Now again, you could say that ours was 3 weeks before the election, the other one I think was 2 weeks or so before the election. Maybe there was late swing, maybe we were right at the time. I'm not convinced again. I don't think there was that late swing. But what makes it doubly interesting and therefore even more confusing is that in our poll, although we got the referendum result massively wrong, recall vote on 2015 general election was almost exactly right. We were a little bit high on Labour and a little bit low on UKIP, which would explain a degree of move. So basically we managed to recall the 2015 election right with a random sample and still got the referendum badly wrong. And that's 3 different random sample polls, all done during the campaign, all getting it wrong.
But aren't you an advocate of the idea that people misreport their recalled votes in line with the party that won? I.e., you think that the BSA and DES...
Yeah, I would. But then it's. I think in the immediate aftermath, yes. I think it then gets slightly difficult in the context of the referendum campaign, because I think that once the Tory party particularly starts splitting itself up, how people would actually then align their past vote with sort of current thoughts is a bit more difficult. Otherwise, I would generally expect there to be a bit higher on Tories.
Any other reflections on the sort of the random thing? Because I want a bit more time to figure out what actually happened, if we can, with these surveys. I agree, it seems implausible, but it also seems a bit implausible that their sample would be so much worse than the sample bias.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, I wondered whether, they were face-to-face surveys, the 2 late random surveys.
Yes.
And I wondered whether there was some measurement error associated with social desirability bias, and that I think remains very much the status quo position and leave not. And I wonder if that might have affected both those ones and the telephone polls, but not the online polls. Although, of course, then you've got the Nat Sen situation where they were actually giving their responses online, apart from some who gave it by telephone, so it was a mixed mode thing. So I'm not quite sure whether it holds up there.
They were a bit closer in the point estimates than the other 2 surveys.
Yes, they were.
Any thoughts on random implications for random? We relied so heavily on that kind of random sampling approach for diagnosing what went wrong in 2015. Is it problematic for us
Well, if it wasn't the sampling that did it this time, then it would have to be some other bullet point on the list. So do we have to conclude that it was a different problem this time?
I think we don't know enough about these surveys yet. Certainly, I do think also, you say your formal words are sort of is sneaking out of it, but I think if we were to find with Nat Sen, I believe they're going to go and do a recontact survey. If we find, it wouldn't take that many, they were 53%, so if it's talking about how many people would need to have shifted to get the result in the confidence interval. I think if you get the result in the confidence interval for a random survey, then what more can you do? You can get close to the point estimate, but that's a random process. So I think you've got to judge random surveys slightly differently, and I think there's still
Well, no, you judge the same way you judge the polls. There was a very sort of ill-informed defence of the polls in 2015, saying, well, most of them were within sampling error. And yes, you can judge one poll by saying, is it within sampling error? But if you've got 3 or 4 polls all done during the same methodology, and they're all within sampling error, but all in the same direction, you're not looking at sampling error anymore, you're looking at bias. And whether you're within sampling error or not is completely irrelevant. If you're all wrong in the same direction, that's bias. And so you can't, yes, you could just take one random poll and say, well, that's all right then. But then you should do the same thing to the opinion polls. And when you've got a series of random polls all wrong in the same way, they're showing bias too.
I think there's a couple of other things, is that even random samples tend to be a little bit over politically engaged compared to the population. So if you look at British election study, it suggests some turnout in the 70s for the general election, which isn't corrected in the weights applied to that data. And of course, polls are far worse than that. In their raw form, you'd expect some turnouts of 80, well into the 80s. So I think even the random samples could do with some adjustment to this. I mean, we make an adjustment to our polls based on something. I can't remember who it was who suggested it a while back, but effectively the idea is you estimate this sort of general election turnout. You have your own model to estimate each individual's likelihood to turn out, and then you apply as part of your weighting matrix a maximum number of voters, and it's very, very impactful on the results when you do this. And we've been using that for about a year, and that's not something we did change. And I wonder if you applied something similar-ish to even the British Election Study and the Nat Sen survey, whether in fact that might have made an impact. And the other thing is that I think that Leave voters were more likely to turn out compared to their compatriots who remain. I mean, we always found that when we applied any sort of voter model that we got more to Leave by doing that. And I'm not sure with the Nat Sen one whether they had applied any such model or for these random samples. And it might be that those two factors in combination would actually shift.
Yes, I agree, but that was one of the arguments was that there was likely to be a low turnout, and that was going to help Leave because they were the ones likely to vote. And in fact, turnout was way higher than anybody thought, so that undermines that a little bit. I mean, the one that we did during the campaign, had we done what I think was ORB put up there did, and only taken those who said they were absolutely certain to vote, we'd have got it absolutely spot on. If we'd done what most pollsters normally do and give weight by 1 to 10 and so on, we'd have been just as bad as the unweighted figures. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just to maybe build on that a little bit in that, it does seem to me that the fact that there were probability samples, random samples, and they didn't get it right, while not telling us what went wrong, is a reasonable clue as to, it helps a little bit, because assuming the probability sampling was done correctly, and we assume that, it takes that big explanation largely out of the picture and leaves the others. And what are the others? There's the measurement error, which is people telling you the wrong thing, either lying at the time or changing their minds afterwards. And then there are the other kinds of non-representativeness, either non-response in your sample, don't knows being kind of something going wrong there, or the peculiar extra feature of any pre-election poll, which is the turnout prediction, because that's what it is. At the time they answer the question, even they don't yet know whether they will vote really or what they will vote for. So it's that extra component of predicting who will vote and how they will vote. If we now have to conclude from these three probability samples that it wasn't the sampling, which after all in the general election diagnosis was the main reason, it then at least focuses the attention more clearly on those remaining things, which is still a long list of possible reasons, but at least a bit more progress.
Yeah, and I think that was, to be fair to us in the inquiry team, I think that was part of our rationale. We weren't saying the ESRC should fund a random probability panel in order to forecast the election result. It was to help us understand what might have gone wrong or to calibrate during the... Anyway, I'll open up to see if there are any questions, comments. Yes, there's one there and then there's lots. Right, good. Okay, you go ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned the online betting market briefly. I was wondering, would it not be cheaper just to look at Paddy Power?
Well, it would, one of the reasons why the sort of betting markets have historically done quite well is what they've done is taken polls and then reached expert opinion on why the polls might be wrong. If you didn't have the polls in the first place, then they'd think that the betting markets would look very, very different.
And actually, there's some interesting work by Chris Felician and Bob Erickson looking at historical performance of betting markets and opinion polls in predicting elections, and they basically show that this idea that betting markets are better at predicting elections is only true if you don't allow for the fact that they're already incorporating information from polls. And actually, again, I would say that both in the referendum and in the general election last year, the betting markets error was much higher. And so like even when the betting markets had good information, if you went and logged on at about 1 o'clock in the morning on the night of referendum, you could make a very tidy sum. I was very disappointed. I didn't have any kind of guts. I only put a small amount on. But the odds were very clearly wrong, even when you had initial information, initial results. So I think there's the people who tell you that betting markets and prediction markets are perfect for predicting a little bit, there's often a tendency to be a little bit fanatical about it, not based on actually evidence.
There's an interesting stat that I picked up during the campaign that 70% of all the money going on the bookies was to Remain, and 70% of all bets were for Leave.
On this same thing, I had a very striking example of this when I was working on the general election exit polls, which I've now done myself 2 elections running and other people many more times. Especially 2010, which if you remember that far back, the exit poll even then was a bit surprising to everybody because it predicted that Lib Dems would do less well than everybody expected, and which turned out to be spot on. And I was, because we had spare time, I was watching the betting markets a little bit, and even after the exit poll was revealed and before the first declarations, the real batch of declarations, i.e. at the point where the only piece of hard evidence available was the exit poll, the markets were still substantially betting against it. And, you know, that's not rational behavior.
No. And I mean, the other example that people have pointed to was that in the was it Oldham and Royston West by-election after the 2015 polling debacle, there was no polling done for that by-election, and there was a very strong consensus that UKIP were going to do very well, possibly win the seat. This was all based on kind of local canvassing and journalistic intuition, which is kind of all we'd have if we didn't have polls, and you know, and that of course proved to be completely wrong, way worse as a prediction than the polls. So yes, and there was a question here, and then here, and then there. Right, all kind of clustered in this set of bits. Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned that polls influence decision makers. I was thinking about the under decision makers, that are people who are going to make that vote, make that choice. And we've seen a lot of stories where people are coming out and looking very sad and saying, "Oh, I only voted Leave because I thought Remain would go." What can we say about this claim that polls might undermine their own efforts?
So I mean, it's a kind of long-standing area of debate around which there's not really a lot of consensus. So there are various. There have been various arguments about bandwagons, about you know, polls influencing behaviour, and my reading of the literature is the evidence is not really particularly clear-cut either way, and people who have sought to show how polls influence voter behaviour haven't tended to be conclusive. I think actually there are arguments for I think, I can't remember precisely the article. There's arguments in particular electoral systems where there are complex thresholds and so forth for parties. Polls actually can be quite informative for voters needing to know whether or not a party needs to get above a 5% threshold to get representation. So although I kind of alluded to the fact that actually the polls inform elites, they involve key decision makers and campaigns, it's very difficult to say to the extent to which that sort of anecdotal evidence of I behaved hyper-rationally possibly is true for some individuals, probably not true for the general population.
You have to be enormously confident in the polls to make your decision on the basis of how close the polls were at the time, which seems irrational.
Yeah, I think there's possibly some evidence that it mobilises more than changes votes. You know, so that if it's closer in the polls, then maybe you're more likely to turn out and vote rather than change. Although there's potentially, I mean, I don't know what the evidence is, as you say, it's pretty sketchy, but you might be more inclined to make a kind of protest vote, you know, if you think, oh, it won't matter. But I don't know. There is some evidence, I think, that when in countries where polling is banned in the weeks before an election, that does systematically increase the voting for smaller parties. So there's a kind of, what political scientists have a very ugly normative term, like wasted voting or something like that for it, but that seems to happen.
Bermondsey by-election polls clearly had an effect, but that's almost the only example I can think of where they showed who was actually the person most likely to beat Peter Tatchell, because a majority of people wanted Peter Tatchell not to win. It showed them how to do it, and the person who was narrowly ahead in the polls then went ahead and won by landslide. But that's the only one I can think of.
I suspect the current Tory party leadership may be being affected by the polling that's going on for that as well. Sorry, there's one here and then... Oh, sorry, you and then you and then you. Yep. Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, just to pick up on the NatSen, it's based on the BSA sample, isn't it? And I mean, they reported 50-50 on their online, on a total sample size of 1,600, which included the telephone, which was way out. And I'm just wondering whether the lack of power in that, because it was such a 600,000 people voted a different way, it would have been a different result. So I just wonder if the lack of power on that might have given us a better result than that one. So I just want to throw it in there. The other thing is about the lack of theory, if you like, underpinning the choices around weighting and whether the application of more qualitative data, because there's also kind of qualitative data floating around from focus groups and you know, newspaper reports, people talking, and my impression was that a lot of them decided to go in leave all the time. That was the constant narrative that I got from just people's response. And then the final thing is on your the recommendations is why we don't move away from point estimates to range estimates like they do in the IPCC and the climate change plan. To say, well, it's not about this number, but it's somewhere around these 2 or 3 numbers.
Okay. So I wasn't. The first point was that if you only look at the online responses, then it's 50-50. So
it's quite close, but it's such a low power, presumably, because there's 1,600 in total. Take out the telephone lines, that's presumably less. I couldn't find the exact numbers.
yeah. Well, that would be if it was 50-50, then it would cover the true value. But.
Well, only if they were the same sorts of people, I guess, but yeah.
I mean, that is interesting because it would fit quite neatly with a measurement error explanation. So, i.e., face-to-face phone. Yoni?
Just quickly on the power, I may have time to say more about it in the context of exit polls if we have time for that. But the bottom line is that when you're estimating something close to 50% from an individual level sample, the power is not high. So for these kinds of polls, it's a tough task to be confident about the conclusion from any one poll. Once you've got the aggregate, then that, of course, the power increases, but any one poll is really not a very powerful instrument for detecting who will win with any sort of confidence.
A bigger sample?
Would have to be quite a lot bigger to be really confident.
But it is, I mean, and that ties in with your final question, I think, is in the recommendations we do, I mean, we're not saying that point estimates shouldn't be reported, but we're saying that you should also report the interval. The problem is that the calculation you would use is not obvious for that. But I know that the BPC members are looking at ways to do that in a more transparent way.
My concern about that is that you then actually sort of give this impression it must be within that. You know, that if you calculate a sampling error based on assumption of a pure random sample, which isn't, you can calculate that allows no measurement error, and it almost implies there is no measurement error. And that's, you know, I'm slightly concerned about creating an impression of spurious accuracy.
Well, we've got that at the moment,
Well, but you could be sort of, you need to caveat it, but once you start putting absolute numbers on it, you then suggest that is the maximum possible range. That's my concern. But we should certainly caveat it more, yeah.
So the question is,
I'm interested because you talked about age, and of course one of the discourses that come out of the Brexit is that there's generational conflict. So I wonder what the polls could tell us about the age, and and also the method, because it's the digital divide is going with older people, 50s, 60s, 70s, and there's probably still the whole 80s and 90s. I just wonder what thoughts you had on that, because is it the older people that have led us to this, and was that coming through your polls?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if it had been, say only the under 40s had been allowed to vote, I think it would have been a 2-to-1 landslide for Remain.
To the bastards didn't vote though, did they? I was told it didn't even turn out.
Well, I think they turned out certainly at higher rates than they did in the 2015 general election. I'd be fairly confident of that. But they were just outweighed. I mean, they were outweighed certainly amongst voters, but also just, pretty close in terms of people, the whole population registered to vote. But I mean, certainly, so if you were to say, I mean, it's one of the things I thought, that it really should have been a supermajority required, because it was a referendum about something permanent or semi-permanent, not the next 5 years. And so that those who are living now, or eligible to vote now, had a responsibility to think about the generation afterwards. Now, of course, people don't do that. So the way to actually achieve the same thing would be set a higher bar, which is not uncommon in referendums, that you set a higher bar than 50%. And David Cameron did have the option of setting a higher bar, but he thought otherwise. For me, I would have thought 60% would have been a much fairer bar.
I think we can all agree on that, but we're talking about methodology here. We can't go back.
Well, yes, given the rules, young people were basically outdone.
But it's not tremendously, it's the same story as for 2015 general election. Young people much more likely to vote Labour, much less likely to turn out.
Yes, but that's it's, to an extent it is their choice, but it is only for 5 years.
Yeah, no, and I'm not saying it's not qualitatively different in terms of the effect, but I think the pattern is broadly the same as it was in 2015.
Although I was just going to say, it does kind of highlight the point that I think there's been some disagreement about the level of turnout among young people. And actually, it's one of the issues that we have about trying to benchmark the analysis that's been done is actually that you're still relying for demographic breakdowns on surveys, and as in the polling inquiry we had to rely on British Social Attitude Survey and British Election Study to try and compare the numbers we're getting. So it is very clear there are demographic differences, there are age differences, but actually if we're trying to get the point estimates, I think I'd be right in saying that the turnout levels for young people vary across pollsters, and actually trying to get a kind of more precise estimate on that is quite difficult still.
Yeah, I just to add to that, we've done, if I was looking back at our work and then saying, well, let's look at registered voters and let's ignore the fact that they turn out at different rates, and then let's, for the don't knows, give them 2 to 1, which seems reasonable given our recontact survey, it would have been a dead heat, pretty much. So instead of the narrow win for Leave, it would have been a dead heat if they'd all turned out at the same rates, as far as I can tell.
Interesting. Well, I was going to actually say one of the things that Yoni's reminded me with that comment is that one of the things that people often wondered going into this referendum is why isn't the BBC and ITV doing an exit poll? Yoni, can you say something about? I think there was another one of these private ones. There wasn't one done. I heard that there was a private exit poll done that was wrong.
We were looking at that the other day. I just think it's implausible if there were an exit poll of any size, someone wouldn't somewhere have tweeted, "Hey, I just got exit polled." And we'd have picked up. And there's plenty on the day polling. I don't think it's an exit poll.
Yeah, so just a few words on that. In other words, about something that did not happen. You remember there is an exit poll in the general election, but its goal is very different. Different, obviously, from the referendum, but also from the polls before a general election, because a general election exit poll is trying to estimate and predict the number of MPs in the House of Commons, which is a really hard task given the first past the post system. In other words, you basically have to estimate vote shares not in the country as a whole, but in 650 different constituencies and model them. Really tough task, but it can be done under the current design, which is a panel design. So the general election exit poll visits more or less same polling stations every time and estimates the change, which is far, far easier and more powerful than estimating the overall levels. So it works, as we have seen in a number of elections now running. Now, suppose somebody had wanted to do something like that for the referendum. You couldn't have done the panel because there is no relevant last time. So that wouldn't work. But you might still have tried to do it. You might have argued that it's, in a way, a simpler task. It's just the one number that you're trying to estimate rather than the 650. And the same one number that all the polls were trying to go for. But as far as we know, it wasn't done. So the broadcasters, BBC, Sky, ITN, who pay for the general election one, chose not to pay for one this time. And as far as we know, as Nick says, no bank or hedge fund, despite the discussion in the public domain beforehand, chose to do that. So the question is, why did they not do that?
It's because no one will do one. That's why. It's simple.
I just wanted to show this being a methods festival in the spirit of research design.
You need to have one equation.
Yes, here's one I prepared earlier. Just as a comment of research design, so the usual thing, teaching-wise, goals and constraints. And the overwhelming constraint for exit poll, the classical exit poll, is that it's done at the polling station. It's a very peculiar kind of face-to-face survey. Interviewers stand outside the building and interview people as they come up. And that dictates not only the sample design that you do, which is that it has to be a clustered sample of polling stations. You sample some number of polling stations, you send people out there, and they interview people coming out. So what does that mean for this situation? Let's try. So let's suppose we sample n polling stations. The design effect here says that if you stratify them carefully based on region and so on, you might get better power a little bit than from a simple random sample of polling stations. But not by much. I think 0.9, which is slightly better than a simple random sample, is about as
good as it will get looking at the results afterwards. So M stations, with each station during the day, you sample, say 150 voters. This really doesn't matter. This number is almost totally relevant for power calculation. You can get enough people while you're there with no trouble at all. So it's really how many stations you sample. So let's suppose we're aiming for the following. Well, the one you actually promised is off this year. So in that empty spare spot,
The one that I uploaded was working, but I'm sure there was the...
well, I'm going to tell you what's in that mystery box. So there's a big question there which says that what is the smallest number of M stations such that we get the power, certain power, some probability of being at least that sure that our confidence interval is the right side of 50. So let's suppose the true proportion is 51. How many polling stations do we need so that we are 90% confident that our interval is entirely the right side of 50? So we're confident about the winner, in other words, under certain assumptions. Let's see what we got here. Now here we've got the numbers that were meant to be revealed rather than hidden. Okay, so I'll talk you through quickly this. So bottom left corner, top left corner is the most challenging situation. There we go. Again, Greek letters are missing. So the 0.951 means, let's suppose the true state of world is 51-49, tight referendum, and we want to be 90% sure that we still get the interval to be on the right side. So we want to be confident to that level. For that ambitious goal, we would need 1,174 polling stations, and hence thinking about the practicalities again. At least Nick, what would it be, about 3 people per station, or 4 interviewers?
Over the course of a day, it's a team of about 5 people.
5, yeah. So about 5,000, say, nearly 6,000 trained interviewers, things like that. Let's suppose we were less ambitious. We wanted only 50% power of detecting the difference. Still the 51 assumption, true, that would be 430. If we lowered ambitions the other way, let's suppose we only wanted to detect the 50 to 48, which was actually this time to be the result, alas. 90% power, 294 stations. And the least ambitious corner there, if we wanted to be 50% sure of catching the 50 to 48 with the interval, so have an even chance of picking the winner, that would require 107 polling stations. Now, are those big numbers? By way of comparison, the general election exit poll that Nick runs so very successfully has 140 polling stations. So that's as many roughly as the 3 broadcasters together are willing to pay for. So at this time, if they had wanted the most ambitious scenario, they would have wanted to pay for about 10 times as many, nearly 10 times as many stations, which is not going to happen. Similarly, this hedge fund or a bank, to be that confident, would have to fork out that much money. For the kind of money they do pay for, we would have been in the bottom right corner. So we would have had sort of a survey that would have had an even chance of picking a 450 to 48 election. Now, if that's the situation, how much work is it? How valuable is that? It's just another poll, basically, for the same number with not a massively high power of being very sure of what we concluded. So maybe these sorts of considerations, maybe some other considerations led to the conclusion that nobody in the end did. It just wasn't worth the money that we would have taken.
No, they were prepared to pay, trust me.
Yeah, I heard that they paid the historian Niall Ferguson $500,000 to tell them who was going to win, and he told them remain. So, I think that's the level of
They were. No, I mean, we agreed that before Joni had done all this multiple calculations, we'd sort of put almost a thumb finger in the air and came up with the fact that we want to be doing about 250 pollings. We need something about twice the scale of a general election one. The BBC and ITV and Sky said they couldn't afford that. And the hedge funds have clearly been hiring people like Joni, or possibly even Joni, I don't know, because they actually came to us saying they wanted to do 250 polling stations. And it's going to be, at least £500,000, which is a very attractive prospect. But sadly, we came to the conclusion that it couldn't be done. It's a very complex process getting an exit poll off the ground. They actually the first people approached us back in April, and we went to our colleagues at Murray who we do it with, and we understandably got very excited by the prospect, and then started thinking it through. The problem is that to do an exit poll successfully, you have to get people literally just as they come out. You can't be in the room, but you need to get them as soon as they come out. And you can't be there without permission of the presiding officer. And to get that, you've got to contact all the local authorities first. You've got to explain what you're doing, etc., etc., etc. It takes a very long time to get them to do it. You have to get them to tell you exactly what each polling station is, so you know who's going to be voting there. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to do that. Plus, when we write to them for the general election, we say, we're doing this exit poll, it's on behalf of the BBC, ITV and Sky, and the results are going to be broadcast to the nation at 10 o'clock exactly, and nothing will be leaked beforehand. And then when we actually wrote this other letter, we sort of, imagine this letter we were writing to them, so we wanted this exit poll for a bunch of really dodgy city-wide boys, just so they could make a bit of money on the side, and it'll come and get leaked during the day. We kind of thought that they might be less keen on saying yes. And so even back in April, we had to reluctantly say, we'd love to take your money, but we can't actually do it. But it's an interesting comment on just how clueless people are about how difficult it is to do, that on the Tuesday, people were still contacting us and saying, can we get you to do a referendum, exit poll for the referendum on Thursday? But there were plenty of people who, without any shadow of doubt, were quite happy to spend £500,000 on doing this, which is kind of frightening.
And just to finish this off, to go back to the...
Sorry.
Now we're going way back from the exit polls to the comparable question for individual level surveys like polls. So imagine you want to be in the bottom right corner, the least ambitious situation, and you were doing a simple random sample of actual individuals, not an exit poll now. Of course, the polls are not simple random samples, but there's something comparable. For the bottom right-hand corner, you would have needed 2,400 people. Top left would be 25,000 or something like that. Of course, when you pull the polls, they end up being bigger than that and so on. But as I was saying earlier, trying to pick a winner in a tight race from individual level survey and do it confidently is really quite difficult. So maybe we could at least give that experience to the poll, or not quite getting it right.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Okay, so I think we're into